The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse have lined up another giveaway, open to anyone who switches their electricity supplier to Fuse.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics when you sign up.
And this time we're putting some merch bundles together for them. I'm thinking hoodies, sweatshirts, hats. If you came to see us on tour, you might have seen some of it already.
But aside from the prizes, well worth considering switching to Fuse. Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money even though the price cap has gone up.
And the great thing is, Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables, which means they're planning for a clean energy future.
It will take you just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up. Fuse will also handle everything with your old supplier, so you won't have to lift a finger.
So download the Fuse app now and use referral code POLITICS after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. So Rory, we're going to do America. We're going to do COP, the climate change conference in Azerbaijan, and then Germany, election coming up.
Yeah, let's start with Donald Trump. So I think Trump probably represents three different things if we just step back for a second. One of them is his policies, which we can get into a little bit and are going to become key. You know, what is he going to do about climate? And we're going to talk a bit about the climate conference happening in Azerbaijan. So he pulled out of the Paris Accords. Will he do the same again? What's he going to do on mass deportations? What's he going to do on Russia, Ukraine? What's he going to do on China, Taiwan? So those are policies. Second thing is just the tone of politics. I was watching Tom Homan, he's now said is going to be his border czar, giving a little speech in Madison Square Gardens.
It was pretty horrible.
Pretty horrible. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's about the way in which even people who agree with Trump's individual policies need to come to terms with the fact that he is running the most incredibly aggressive, dehumanizing, belittling type of politics. I mean, that's what I find is so disturbing for conservative colleagues of mine who want to get behind him. Surely they can't remotely buy into that kind of divisiveness and horror and language. And then I think the third thing is the worldview. So we'll have a chance, I hope, to talk a bit about the Middle East. And there, the key question is trying to understand what is Trump's view of the world and America's place in the world. Anyway, over to you on some thoughts on Trump.
Well, I think on the place in the world, I mean, there's a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, when he says America first, he means America first. And we said on one of the live streams, I think, or it might have been the podcast last week, that since the advent of the Boeing 747, he traveled less than any previous president. So it is about America. And yet, on the other hand, he will enjoy the fact that in virtually every conversation taking place at COP, even though he is not there, he will be being talked about because people will be saying, what's Trump going to do in relation to the Middle East, in relation to Ukraine, in relation to all big foreign policy issues right now? Trump is a very, very big part of the conversation. And of course, it's moving so quickly away from Biden. I mean, you had that horrible image that Biden isn't just a lame duck, he's a duck without legs. And so yesterday you had Biden and Kamala Harris at the Veterans Day, very presidential, very official, very formal, but it almost looked like something that a king would do, you know, the King Charles would do here. It was representative, it wasn't political. And then meanwhile, over here, you've got Trump and everything he says or does, and anybody who arrives at Mar-a-Lago, it's big news. But I think what you said there about the performative nature, I mean, that Tom Homan looked to me like, I mean, some, you know, live on television, he's a badass president, you know, these people are scum. I mean, you know, just really, really aggressive, you say. And also I've noticed that in these little videos that Trump is putting out, he's become much more aggressive. Whatever you say about Trump, when he's doing those rallies, he says nasty things, but his style is always, he calls it the weave, but it's very kind of mellifluous. And he's got this often very calm way of speaking, and he's trying to reassure his people there that he's a nice guy. And yet these videos, he did one the other day that I think was positively Orwellian, where essentially he was announcing, with Elon Musk backing, that they were scrapping this kind of anti-disinformation unit that have been set up.
Is that the unit that Jamie Rubin was involved in, or related to the Jamie Rubin thing? Yeah.
I think it is, yeah. I think it's part of the same thing. Essentially, Jamie Rubin, former Assistant Secretary of State under Clinton, now working alongside Tony Blinken, the current Secretary of State. And essentially, it was taking on disinformation operations from China and Russia and Iran. And I think they were having some success in pushing back on that. But what Trump's address on it delivered very, very aggressively, and essentially was saying this is about protecting our freedoms because we believe in free speech. But actually, it was positively Orwellian because, you keep talking about jujitsu. They're using jujitsu. They're saying we're going to allow more disinformation. Why? Because actually, my friend Elon, he really likes misinformation because he's managing to weaponize it, and that really helped me to win the election. So I think that aggression's, I think you're right about that. And I think the worldview is this contradiction between America first and we are really powerful now. We are the most powerful people in the world.
Yeah.
The other thing, by the way, Roy, just on all this stuff, we endlessly, I did it at the Sophie Ridge program on Sky yesterday, and Gitto Harry, Boris Johnson's comms director, was asking me whether I thought Keir Starmer should get rid of David Lammy because of his previous tweets about Trump. I mean, heaven's sake, J.D. Vance, who's now going to be the vice president, called him Hitler. Marco Rubio, who is now up for, it seems, for being Secretary of State, he said that if Trump hadn't been left 20 billion, whatever it was, by his dad, he'd be selling fake gold watches on Fifth Avenue. So this idea that sort of a few tweets by a Labour politician should somehow, negate their capacity. So I think the worldview is what's really interesting.
So it strikes me that we've often talked about the world being on a sort of knife edge between a liberal global order view of the world, which kind of 1990s, early 2000s, which is an idea of the United Nations, interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo. Tony Blair gave a speech called The Responsibility to Protect. These are all ideas about the fact there are basic universal human rights and that the purpose of the world is, particularly of the West, is to support democracy, support peace. And out of that comes other things, the end of apartheid, the Good Friday Agreement, all this stuff, right? And we've sort of talked about being on a knife edge between that and a very, very different view of the world. Trump's re-election makes me feel that we're no longer on the knife edge. We've now flipped over pretty decisively into the new view of the world. And the new view of the world is, I think, a view of the world that is much older than people understand. It's not just a pre-1989 view of the world, because in fact, America from the Second World War onwards, during the Cold War, was, with all the hypocrisy and all the damage and all the problems, still very values-driven, still spent a lot of time talking about democracy and human rights and international institutions. And even Woodrow Wilson, after the First World War, had a very idealistic vision of the world and of nations and of identity. Trump is taking us back to a universe which feels much more like a sort of Bismarck 19th century, real grim realpolitik, where I think he feels that he doesn't care what other people do in their own countries, as long as it's not affecting the United States. And he's completely uninterested in what we used to call non-state actors. So he sort of takes states seriously, but he particularly takes powerful states seriously. He doesn't care too much about borders. It's sort of okay for Russia to chew a bit off the edge of Ukraine, probably okay for Israel to chew a bit of southern Lebanese territory. But generally speaking, he's not going to get involved in any conversations at all about what you do within your own borders. Do you buy into that kind of view?
Yes, I do. I think the exception is where he thinks that it impinges upon American interests. Take China, Taiwan. He wouldn't want China to invade Taiwan. Why? Because it would plunge the American economy into considerable difficulty. Two, it would confront him with a massive choice. Joe Biden had made that choice. He'd basically said, we would stand by Taiwan, as it were. Would Trump do it? Don't know. But thirdly, it would play into this idea that China is becoming the more dominant force in the world. So there's an example of something where another country would do something to a smaller territory which Trump would see as having an impact upon him. Why did he care, for example, about Brexit? He seems to have cared about Brexit. Why? Because I think he sort of likes the sort of nationalistic flavour to it, but also because he does see, I think, the weakening of the European Union as a strategic goal. But I think, because I think the worldview that he has is actually Xi Jinping, what a great guy, what a smart guy. Putin, he never really calls out Putin in the way that people feel that he should, given what Putin has done to the world and what he's done in Ukraine. So I think his worldview is, I'm a master of the universe. I'm one of the very small number of people in the world who has really been able to establish incredible personal and political power. Therefore, I have the right to carve up the world. And the other people I'm going to carve the world up with, they're the other guys who've done the same thing. And Vladimir Putin, what a guy. Xi Jinping, what a guy. Modi, he looks like he might be the kind of guy I could deal with. Shame he didn't do as well in his election as I did in mine, but he's the sort of guy I can deal with. So I think that's his worldview. And that's what makes it difficult for European leaders who, thankfully, are still sort of committed to democratic values, liberal world order, etc. It's going to be harder, I think, for them maybe to influence him in the way that they want to.
Well, if we think about what that liberal world order was, it emerged out of the Second World War with the US as the big dominant power. It kept going through the 1980s with the G7.
And with the United Nations as a fundamental pillar of global security.
Yes, exactly. It was a fundamental pillar of global security so long as the US, which is the world's largest economy, and then the G7, these Western economies, were still enormously powerful right the way through the 70s and 80s. They were maybe almost 3/4 of the world economy. But when you get into a situation where the permanent members of the Security Council, the three biggest of them, or certainly China and America, by far the largest. I mean, China's 7 times larger than the British or the French economy, and maybe 8, 9 times larger than the Russian economy. So if the biggest players on the Security Council are adopting this much darker worldview where they don't really believe in international laws, international courts, international human rights, anything really except for might is right, then I don't see how the thing can continue. I mean, Britain and France are now so tiny compared to those economies that it's very difficult to understand how Europe could sort of in some strange solitary way try to keep a global order going if America turns away from it.
Yeah. Just to sort of underline how things have changed so fundamentally, so radically, there was a sense, whether even if you accept that there was a feeling that the Ukraine war was kind of grinding into a sort of pretty difficult stalemate, with Russia probably feeling the momentum was on their side because they can kind of throw more bodies at the whole thing. But when Trump says, we all know, nobody takes seriously the idea that he can do a deal in 24 hours, which is what he said. However, that he will want to bring that to an end somehow, I think we can probably accept. He will want to try to bring that to an end. Why? Because it will reflect well on him if he can. But secondly, I was really surprised when we were in America, the 2 trips that we've made to the States in recent times, I was surprised the extent to which this idea that there were no wars going on when Trump was president first time around, the extent to that was really helping him politically. Now, we've grown up, and I can certainly remember growing up, the thought you had that America, there was a sort of, it was the kind of global policeman. It was the sort of the one that was always in there where the wars were being fought, where you think about the CIA and all the role they used to play in, elections and toppling regimes and all that sort of stuff. And he kind of is saying, I don't want to be involved in any of that. And that gives him incredible leverage in these, for when he becomes president this second time around. And what's really interesting about the way he's operating now, every day since the election, he has been putting out stuff that is it's shaping the agenda already. And he's using appointments at the moment. He can't do policy, he's using appointments. So we mentioned Marco Rubio, Tom Homan we've mentioned, who's very, very hard right.
So just quickly on that, Rubio is a good example because Rubio is somebody who has spoken openly about cutting up Ukraine and voted openly to prevent financial support going to Ukraine. And
Absolutely.
almost regardless of Trump's statements and the sort of deal he's talking about, all he has to do is make sure that Ukraine doesn't continue to receive US financial support. And Ukraine's in real trouble. The $50 billion it gets from the US is really what allows it to stop mid-level
Yeah.
airstrikes. It's what manages to get its artillery going. It's what allows it to just about hang on to the front line. Now, that doesn't mean that without the $50 billion, Ukraine is going to disappear off the face of the map, but it will turn the conflict much more into a Russian colonial war. It will turn Ukraine into a semi-occupied territory if the front lines aren't drawn that will feel more like France and Algeria and less like what we've got now, which is more like the First World War.
But it will also up the pressure on Europe. France, Germany, UK, Poland. I mean, I guess they're the sort of big four in a way in terms of defence, but it will put the pressure up. And then, of course, you've got the Baltic states, which are already ramping up their defence spending, but it would nothing like to fill the sort of gap that would emerge if America pulled the plug.
Even if almost unimaginably the European countries decided to add another $50 billion to their expenditure, and proportionally that would mean the UK putting in another £12 billion or so. Is it likely, really, that Rachel Reeves is going to want to find another £12 billion a year to put into Ukraine? And even if she did, where are the weapons coming from? Because we're simply not producing weapons fast enough. Germany now has a sort of 25-year lag on various critical weapons because so much has gone into Ukraine already. So it's just not possible in the 6 months to 12 month frame for Britain to fill the gap of the United States. So that's, I'm afraid, in some sense, done. There is no the scenario that we might have fantasized about a few months ago, which is that Ukraine rebalances, trains, manages to put together an all-arms assault, capitalizes on its progress in Russian territory, pushes back Russia on the front line a little bit so that it's in a better position for negotiation, is gone. It will now be negotiating from a much weaker position. And at the very minimum, that'll mean saying that, as you said yesterday when we were chatting, that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO or the EU. But more than that, I think Putin will want a very compliant regime, a puppet regime in Kiev, and probably the price will be that Zelensky has to step down.
Almost certainly that. Almost certainly Ukraine sort of commits to never wanting to join NATO. Ditto, as you say, the European Union. And there was some of the sort of noises around. I don't know whether this was real, okay? And I decided not to check because I was so horrified at the sight of it. Somebody posted something that said Don Trump Jr., Donald Trump's son, had posted this video of Zelensky being showered with dollars, dollar bills that were sort of coming out of the sky. And the message was something like, enjoy it while it lasts because, your grant is coming to an end kind of thing. Now, that is an attitude. And by the way, J.D. Vance, he's been very much on this kind of, it's Europe's war, let Europe sort it out. So I think it's very hard to see how that is going to end in a way that Zelensky would approve or appreciate. And meanwhile, because he does have a very kind of likes to explain things very, very simply. So far as he'll come along and say, right, I said I'd do a deal. Here's the deal. It's done. The consequences for countries like Moldova, the consequences for Poland, the consequences for the Baltic states, will they even go into the equation? So again, Europe is going to have to start thinking those questions long before he gets to the White House.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the thing. This was originally a Sarah Palin post. People remember Sarah Palin, John McCain's running mate, the beginnings of this strange forms of populism in the US. I mean, Sarah Palin was a sort of canary in the mine. She was the first example of a kind of mini Trump-like figure. And she posted this thing saying 38 days till your allowance comes to an end, with a picture of dollar bills falling. And then Donald Trump Jr. then reposted it to mock him just now to reinforce this sense.
So it was real.
It was absolutely real. To now jump to the Middle East, we haven't updated people much on the Middle East. And of course, what's been happening is that while people have been distracted by the US election, Israel has made a number of very, very dramatic military steps and advances. So, in effect, now Israel has established military positions on southern Lebanese territory, which it doesn't look like it has any desire to give up anytime soon. It will be the equivalent of the Golan Heights in Syria.
Yeah.
That'll be Israel occupying a bit of Lebanon to give it the ability to hit any positions, any Hezbollah positions that could threaten it. At the same time, the Israeli military commander in northern Gaza, has said that 250,000, so 250,000 Palestinian residents, will not be returning to northern Gaza. And at the same time, we have Smotrich and Ben-Gvir now talking openly, apparently with the backing of the Netanyahu government, about the annexation of the West Bank. Now, annexation means that instead of the current situation where technically the West Bank is a combination of Palestinian Authority ruled and Israeli occupied territory divided up into 100 little segments, people like Smotrich, who talk openly about annexation, mean let's just make most of the West Bank, probably not all of it, but most of the West Bank just part of Israel. And added to that, and by the way, we're not going to give votes to the Palestinians in that territory, because if we gave votes to Palestinians in that territory, we'd end up in a situation where we wouldn't have a Jewish state anymore. And he's talked in the past about how he sees this working. He says either they would accept the situation or they'd leave, or if they tried to resist, they'd be shot. So this is a big attempt by the right in Israel to reshape events on the ground very, very quickly under the cover of the US election and create a new reality before Trump's arrival. Their instinct is that Trump is sympathetic to Israel, but that he's not going to want a war in the Middle East after he comes in. So they think that if they can make a huge amount of progress, kill a lot of people, change the facts on the ground in Israel's favor, then perhaps they can press the brake button, give Trump the credit for bringing peace to the Middle East, but leaving Israel in a much stronger position militarily than it was before. It's not completely straightforward, though, because as we said, although Netanyahu's been falling over backwards to congratulate Trump, and you noticed when he addressed Congress, he praised Trump repeatedly and not Biden. In fact, I don't think he mentioned Biden. Trump has been a bit angry with him for congratulating Biden in 2020. And Trump has also in the past made statements about not being in favor of more settlements. But basically, I think we just come back to your beginning point, which is these are details. Trump effectively is somebody who believes in strong men, has a very, very strong base within his own party, which is heavily pro-Israel, and where I don't think he's going to be very fussed about the question of what exactly Israel is doing. And the question of what Israel is doing in Gaza remains very open. I mean, why are 250,000 people not supposed to be returning? Is that because it's going to be left empty as a sort of buffer zone? Would they think of putting settlements in there? Perhaps not, because those settlements will be too vulnerable. What then happens to the population of Gaza? Because Israel's also kept 3 absolutely critical corridors, one in the north, one in the center, one in the south. And one in the south is the border with Egypt, which would allow, in theory, Israel to open the tap and let Palestinians into Egypt, which would cause a massive problem because Egypt would then threaten to break off treaty relations with Israel.
Yeah. 3 quick points I think worth just recapping. One is Netanyahu finally sacked Gallant, his defense minister. Now, Gallant is by no means a liberal, and is a very, very tough, hard-headed military guy. But there had been talk of the two of them not getting on very well. But I suspect that's also part of this bigger power battle with the hard right, with the Ben-Gvir Smotrich. So they've been strengthened by that. The second thing I think is worth just reflecting on is the fact that Qatar has suspended its work as the mediator in the ceasefire and hostage release talks between Israel and Hamas. Now, what reading between the lines, between what they said, was their feeling that both sides, Hamas and Israel, were not negotiating in good faith. Now, it was quite a big deal, I think, for them just to say, and essentially what they say is that they don't believe these talks are going anywhere. So whether that was a way of trying to, I don't know, prod the process, whether it was a way of signaling to the incoming American administration that this thing is a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult. But I thought that was interesting and pretty worrying. And then a third thing that I think is worth just a little bit of reflection on, Rory, is because it shows the extent to which the Israel-Gaza conflict has just penetrated kind of every level of debate in so many countries around the world, was this issue of the football violence in Amsterdam. I don't know if you followed this at all, but this is where Ajax Amsterdam were playing Maccabi Tel Aviv, and there was some really, really, really bad violence. And since then, there has developed this battle of the narrative, which we have in war. You have a battle of narrative between, Israel saying this is us having a legitimate response to October 7th, and people on the Gaza side saying this is us being absolutely wiped out by an implacable enemy. That's the narrative that goes on both sides. And in this one, the narrative is from the Dutch. These Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters came and were provocative, and they were burning Palestinian flags, and they were abusing Muslims in the street, etc., etc. And then from the Israeli narrative, that some peaceful supporters of an Israeli football team came to Amsterdam, and they were attacked, and you had right-wing politicians like Wilders and Herzog, the president of Israel, essentially saying this was a sort of modern pogrom. I mean, the violence was bad. The chanting of anti-Islam and anti-Arab songs was bad, and the response was bad. But, it's just a classic example of something like a football match in such a volatile political situation can become part of this broader war about the narrative.
I mean, I think one of the questions around the narrative is the gap that's emerged between the views of American campuses, an enormous number of young people, social media, all of which has been very, very critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, and the sense that with Trump's election, governments are just shrugging that off. And I wonder whether this bigger story of someone like Trump coming in and his very grim realpolitik view of the world, which isn't very interested in human rights or the rights of non-state actors, means that we're creating a world with a bigger and bigger gap between what young people and a great deal of social media wants and what the governments represent. And, for example, we'll see this also in the UAE and Saudi. So UAE has remained, since the Abraham Accords, in close diplomatic connection with Israel. But we know that almost all Arabs are outraged by what's happening, and you can see the Saudi government now talking openly about genocide. But a tension will emerge between the cliche of what used to be called the Arab street, but is increasingly a kind of online Arab street of many, many people, or the vast majority, I would say, of the people that I know in the Middle East who are violently appalled by genocide, who are blaming what they see as Western hypocrisy and indulgence of what Israel's doing. I met a wealthy couple yesterday who said to me, we've just learnt from this that one European life is clearly worth 500 Arab lives, and we can see the hypocrisy. You talk about international law when it comes to Ukraine, you don't care about international law when it comes to Gaza. What will that then mean for these regimes? How do the Saudis and the Emiratis balance their desire to be close to the US through Israel, their desire to find some sort of support or balancing against Iran, with the fact that their own populations are increasingly angry about the situation? Are we now in a kind of fatal gap between populations and governments?
Yeah, and don't forget as well, there is a kind of bifurcation going on between when we talk about young people, there's an assumption a lot of young people, more progressive, more radical, more concerned about the climate, etc. And yet, on the other hand, a lot of young people are driven by Andrew Tateism, by a belief that government doesn't work and that therefore we should move towards something more authoritarian. I think I've said to you before, every continent on the planet, the decile most attractive to authoritarian or even military rule is not the old, it's the young, and it's young men. This is why I think I think we were right when we talked when we were in New York about this being potentially one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime, because so many of these themes and so many of these policy issues are up for change. We talk about Trump getting a landslide. Actually, within the blue wall, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, he wouldn't have taken that much of a swing towards Kamala Harris for her to won those. I mean, I know that's all what-ifery.
Yeah.
But the second thing to point out, and this I think is really quite worrying, if you put together on the ballot, if you were analysing the result, Harris, Trump, and did not vote wins. Trump lost support. He actually had fewer votes this time. And he got 73.6 as opposed to 74.2 4 years ago. And by the way, that's with a population that has grown by 8 million. And likewise, Joe Biden got 81.3 4 years ago, and Kamala Harris this time got 69.3. So she lost, in fact, if you look at those numbers, by dint of people not voting who had previously voted for Joe Biden.
I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's also fascinating. We can share some stuff. NPR's done some very good data on this if people are into the geeky stuff. But, Trump won in Georgia and pushing it up above where he was before, that there are some very interesting demographics which seem to have switched in a way that people didn't anticipate from Biden to Trump. That the assumption 6 months ago when I went to all these kind of US polling companies and psephologists was that people had made up their minds. Everybody knew whether they were in support of Trump or Biden. Nobody was going to change their minds. It was a tiny number of swing voters that was going to hover around Pennsylvania. That isn't quite the picture. The picture, as you say, has been a distinct drop in the vote for Kamala Harris, but also a surprising, at least in terms of what people were predicting, number of people who would have voted for Biden last time now voting for Trump, changing their minds.
Yeah. Keir Starmer's about to speak at COP. Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations, has just talked about the last year being a masterclass in climate destruction. And again, people may feel we've already talked enough about Trump, but this COP happening in Azerbaijan, that was a pretty critical choice of venue that got a lot of criticism because of their oil and gas interests, but happening. And in a sense, this underlines that, yes, Donald Trump is the new president and it will lead to a lot of change. But at the same time, the world has got to carry on trying to limit global warming, climate change from some of the, ever-growing catastrophes that we've seen, not least recently in the United States.
Yeah, we talked in the first half about liberal global orders and ideas of human rights and the UN leading, but there's nowhere where that's more important than in the issue of climate, because obviously there's no real enforcement mechanisms in the amazing Paris Agreement. It was bringing together 170 odd countries to voluntarily sign up to keeping global warming under 1.5 degrees. And it was dependent on the sense that there was a common interest and that people were prepared to make sacrifices, individual nations, sacrifices for the common good. So Britain, for example, as a result of it, actually a great deal of it under the Cameron government, to give them credit, did quite a lot to decarbonize, stopped coal, did a dash for gas, put a lot of cost on energy prices, and as a result, dramatically reduced carbon production. Although, of course, we can talk a little bit about the fact that one of the consequences of that is we still consume a lot of carbon. It's just produced in other people's countries. But core to this is the question of whether there really is a good relationship between the US, China, India, and Russia, who are the really big emitters. Those are the big four that really matter. And in almost every case, we're looking at a situation in which they continue to increase their emissions. And we're now going into a COP where, this was meant to be the thing that we cared almost more about than anything else. And yet Macron is not going to be there. Putin's not going to be there.
Scholz is not going to be there.
Ursula von der Leyen's not going to be there. And even more astonishing, Brazilian President Lula, who's hosting it next year, sounds like he's not going to be there.
I think and again, the American attitude. So the guy that Trump is picking for the job of running the Environmental Protection Agency, a guy called Lee Zeldin, a former congressman, he is very much in the kind of America First approach to energy. He said his big goal is to restore US energy dominance. And there's a body called the League of Conservation of Voters, which analyzes politicians around the world on their commitment to environmental protection. And gives them scores out of 100 based on what they've said and what they've done. And he is very, very low. He gets 14 out of 100. And that shouldn't surprise us because, what did Trump say? That his approach to the environment was drill, baby, drill.
Which I think that's lifted from Sarah Palin, to return to our kind of I think she was the first great advocate of that phrase.
Oh my God, Sarah Palin's still having a malign influence upon the world. The other thing that's interesting is looking at some of the coverage this morning, is how few, and this goes again, this re-emphasizing some of the change that I think the nature of Trump's politics brings. There are so few women. When you see the family photo of all the leaders who've arrived there, I think you're in single figures for the women. I'm not saying that's, that it's just an observation that I'm making about something else that we thought was maybe moving in a certain direction. More and more women leaders actually now appears to be going into reverse. I thought we talked recently about when we were talking about Fuse and we talked about Ed Miliband. Both of us were saying, he seems to really found his métier in terms of his job. And we should maybe put it in the newsletter. He did a social media post from his department, and it was really upbeat. A bit like when we interviewed Bill Gates on Leading. Remember Bill Gates? You and I were both very down about climate, and he was sort of very, very positive. So, and Keir Starmer's speech, he's actually setting very, very ambitious goals. A lot of them will be dependent upon the private sector making change and making commitment as well. So that, could further. You and I were doing an event yesterday with some business people who I think it's fair to say felt the budget was not really, didn't seem to go down terribly well with them, whether this will as well. But, the fact is, on the climate, with Trump coming in with a different position, the other leaders are really going to have to step up to keep this moving in the right direction.
Just to remind people of the stakes. So Paris was about keeping global emissions down to a rise of 1.5 degrees centigrade in global mean temperatures. And that was going to require a very dramatic reduction in emissions by 2030, which is not very long away now.
Mm.
And in fact, instead of a reduction in global emissions, what we've seen is emissions continuing to increase. So we're going to miss that 1.5% target at the moment by a very, very long way. Right? Instead of a reduction of 37, 40%, which is what people were hoping for, we're going to see actually an increase. And this matters because the reason why they chose 1.5% is 1.5% is the point at which relatively linear, predictable climate change has a much higher likelihood of flipping into something much less linear and much less predictable. So that's the level at which people start worrying about the Greenland ice sheet, which is 7 meters worth of ice. That's when the boreal forests or the Amazon rainforest could start suffering very, very badly with a huge effect on oxygen. That's the point at which the Gulf Stream could be affected. And that's before you get onto permafrost, coral reefs, the West Antarctic. So it really, really, it wasn't an arbitrary target. It was chosen because it had real world meaning and we're due to miss it.
Yeah.
The decision made last year in UAE was to insist, Sultan, who was chairing it, insisted that they were going to stick to the target. And I guess I wanted to get you on this because I can see the argument for why you stick to a target even if you think you're going to miss it. But I can also imagine that in doing so, you seem increasingly unrealistic and discredit. And just to get to the number of what I'm talking about, I worried in Afghanistan that the more unrealistic we were in our language, saying we were going to turn Afghanistan to a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law, the more we deepened cynicism and increased the pressure for a total withdrawal. And if we'd been able to find a language which was more realistic, saying, okay, we're not going to be able to make it into Denmark, but we can make a better Afghanistan, we would have been able to sustain it more. So the analogy here is, how do you get the judgment call right on saying, what are the risks of saying, okay, listen, we're not going to make 1.5%, but that doesn't mean we should give up on everything. Let's instead have a real effort at 2%. Or do you agree with Sultan, who says that if you give an inch, the whole thing's over?
So it's interesting. You and I were having a chat about something yesterday, and you were saying that one of the reasons you were a bit disappointed with the Labour government so far was that you felt that the sense of forward vision wasn't clear, wasn't strong. Where's the utopia that lies ahead? And I was making the point that there isn't a utopia ahead, but there is change and there is challenge. And Keir Starmer is very much more of that sort of politician that wants to focus on the scale of the challenge. And yet there he is in Baku now saying that he's going to set out a goal of reducing emissions by 81% compared to 1990 levels by 2035, which is a very, very big ambition.
That is a bit of a slip, isn't it? Because originally the idea was net zero electricity by 2030, which we're hearing less about now. Is that right?
Exactly. And this is also not quite as easy to understand. But my point is that I think you do need big, ambitious targets. And the downside, obviously, is that you fail to meet them. But when you were talking, what dropped into my head was all the times in the Northern Ireland peace process when we were setting goals and setting targets and laying down deadlines, and they weren't met.
Yeah.
But then, as you pass them, you have to use them to kind of emphasize, to redouble, to step up again. And I think with the climate, what I really worry about in relation to the climate debate, if you just think about recent weeks, we had those hurricanes in America. We had those incredible scenes in Spain, near Valencia, where, I couldn't help thinking that there we are, we're sending people to jail in the UK because they stop cars from being able to move freely around motorways. And yet, if you want to see the worst traffic jam in history, it was the one that you saw in Spain with those cars piled on top of each other after that torrential rain. I mean, it was a year's worth of rain in a few hours. So I think we're having these events, but when they come along, the discussion tends to be about weather and about the cleanup operation and about the drama of the whole thing. It seems to me that we've lost that leadership that people like Al Gore were giving for quite a long time, that this is actually not about weather, not about terrible things happening, terrible though they are. It is about climate, and it's about climate change and the threat that's posing to the world. And I think that, COP, we're going to see lots of the usual stuff of people making big speeches, as Guterres has just done, as Keir Starmer's going to be doing shortly. We'll be seeing lots of all the sort of late night negotiations and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, in the end, there has to be, and if Trump is going to vacate this field, others have to step up on this global leadership about this being, it remains the most serious existential threat.
Then the question is where the undercurrents go, because clearly the number one issue for far-right populists in Europe has been immigration. I mean, we get criticized for using the phrase far-right, but the AfD are far-right, Kickler Nostra is far-right, Geert Wilders are far-right. These are proper far-right people. Some of them are campaigning with posters referring to the Third Reich. But along with their statements about immigration are a lot of statements attacking policies on climate change. And the reason for that, of course, is, as we've said before, that the most sensible way of reducing people's carbon energy use is by taxing it. But because energy use is a much bigger proportion of the budget as someone on a low income, it's regressive. The way that governments have tended to do it are very regressive. So there will be increasing pressure. And I think within the European Union, there's a real risk that as right-wing parties get more and more power and they shift the political conversation further right, we're going to end up as well. And then your point that you made before the break becomes important. We've tended to imagine that young people are the great supporters of climate change and that therefore politicians will appeal to young people by putting climate change front and center. But if you end up with a lot of young people, particularly young men, increasingly skeptical about climate change, reluctant to do anything about it, then where is the constituency? Who are you relying on? Are you relying on a bunch of middle-aged, progressive, liberal Greens, which doesn't sound like it's a big electoral base enough to really make the sacrifices? And the reason the sacrifices matter is that, we now have all these charts coming out in the UK pointing out that because of our climate policies, our industrial energy costs are about twice those of competitor nations, and that's one of the reasons our manufacturing industry is collapsing.
To go back to the American position and Project 2025, and by the way, when you see the sorts of things that Trump is saying and doing since the election, when you see the sort of appointments that he's making, I don't think we should kid ourselves that when he said that Project 2025, we didn't know what it was, didn't know what we were talking about. This is very much, we are seeing a lot of the Project 2025 stuff. And their approach on climate, they are in the hoax end of the market. They talk endlessly about the climate alarm industry. They talk about the so-called climate crisis. And so, all the big battles, they always have to be refought. And this is one that I think really has to be refought. So I'm glad that Keir Starmer seems to be staking out a pretty strong and clear position. Ed Miliband, as I say, he was very, very, very full on in terms of the direction of travel. Now, it is going to be difficult and it is going to be controversial because there are costs attached to it. And, we're already seeing people who are saying, well, hold on, my taxes are, you said that my taxes weren't going to go up, but actually national insurance, I see that as a tax on me. We hear that a lot. We've seen the winter fuel payment and so forth. So there's going to be, it won't be difficult for the Farages of this world or Kemi Badenoch to weaponize any attempt to go down a route that says you and I end up paying more to tackle climate change. But if we don't, we always talk about thinking about our children and grandchildren. Well, this is the big one on that.
And I think their first route in will be to say, and this is where we have to be very careful, people like us who want to keep this thing going and on the agenda and progressing, is the first route in of the critics is to say, your targets are obviously not realistic. They're obvious total fantasies. And try to use that as an argument to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay. Now, when I was with you recently, you got a text from Emmanuel Macron. I hope I'm not being indiscreet there. And that got me thinking about you, Macron, Keir Starmer's visit to France, what's going on in Germany. As our local French-German expert, I was very impressed too that you were texting back with Macron in French. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in France, what's going on in Germany.
Both have been forced into holding elections earlier than they were scheduled to be held. Macron had the election that led to now Michel Barnier being the prime minister, and actually Barnier doing a pretty good job, it has to be said. He's calmed things down day to day. The French government seems to be functioning pretty well. But the truth is, back to the question of the far right, Le Pen is sort of hovering. She can bring this government down whenever she wants. And meanwhile, in Germany, the Ampel coalition, that's Ampel is German for traffic lights. So you've got the Red, the SDP, the Free Democrats, yellow, and the Greens, obviously green. And what's happened is that the Scholz, who gets a reputation for being a bit dull and a bit robotic, if you want to see him when he's not being dull and robotic, see his reaction and the interviews he was giving after he sacked Christian Lindner, who was the finance minister and who is part of the Free Democrat Party. And this had been coming for a while because they weren't getting on. If you listen to the Robert Habeck, who is a Green and is going to be the Green Chancellor candidate in the upcoming election, he admitted recently that they've been fighting the whole time that this coalition has been up and running. So what's been going on is that this sort of fighting that's been going on behind the scenes has now kind of exploded into the open. And it's wrong to say the government has collapsed. The coalition has broken, and Scholz is now currently running a minority government, but he accepts there has to be a vote of confidence in the government. Everybody expects him to lose that vote of confidence, and then there will be election. The question then is the timing. Now, the timing thus far has been a disaster. He sacked Lindner on the day that Trump won the election, and his original plan was to have the vote of confidence in the German parliament in the week that Trump took office. Now, if ever you wanted a message to say to the Americans, that Europe's in a complete mess, that would do it. So he's now under huge pressure to bring it forward, preferably before the Christmas break, and then the election will be sometime early in the new year. I know you're not a betting man anymore, Rory. I think you've had your fill of betting. But if you were a betting man, you wouldn't get great odds. But I think Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Christian Democrats, is nailed on.
Yeah.
My prediction as to what happens is that they're going to go back after the next election to a grand coalition between the Christian Democrats with Merz as Chancellor and probably Boris Pistorius, who's he's the most popular politician in Germany at the moment. He's the defense minister. I think he'll be the pick of whether it's finance minister or possibly foreign minister. I don't know.
Just to go back to the kind of basics for listeners who aren't quite as much into the details of German politics as you are, the AfD, this far-right party in Germany, is consistently second now in the opinion polls. right? I mean, that would be like, I mean, it's a much more right-wing party than the Reform Party in Britain, and often getting 19% in the opinion polls. CDU is at about 32%, and they are the centre-right party are the big guarantee, really, that is controlling and keeping back the AfD. But that means that a colossal, more than 50% of the German population is either going for the moderate right or the far right. And that, meanwhile, Schulz has collapsed to about 15%, and the Greens are at about 11%. So it looks like the CDU are the great guarantee to stop the far right taking over in Germany. But again, if things went wrong, you could imagine in 4 or 5 years' time, Germany too, ending up in a position where Alice from the AfD could be en route to the chancellorship.
I think we're quite away from that, but you're right that we live in very volatile times, and who knows. But it's interesting how Merz, who is he's quite an interesting character. He's been around for a long time. He and Angela Merkel did not get on. He felt that Angela Merkel wasn't conservative enough. He's a very conservative. So he went off into the wilderness for a while, and as soon as she went, he came back and has risen to be, as I say, pretty much as guaranteed as you're going to get, is likely to come top in the next election and try to form a coalition. At the moment, he's putting pressure on Scholz to call this confidence vote, but he's not doing it in conjunction with the AfD or the hard left, the Sarah Wagenknecht party, because he knows that to do that, any sort of cooperation with the AfD on something like this, he would pay a price for that. So Scholz actually is able to call the shots in terms of when this is going to be. And Scholz is using this interregnum to do a couple of very interesting things. The first is he's using it to say, not least because of Trump, we're going to have to commit more to Ukraine. So he wants to have a vote in the parliament before the vote of confidence about getting more money to Ukraine.
Which the far right and the far left are very much against.
Which the far right and the far left are against. And so therefore that is basically saying to Merz, if you're a serious leader of a serious country, you know what you've got to do. And then the second issue that is that he wants to do, this is being called AfD proofing the appointment of judges. The system of appointing of judges in Germany involves the parliament, but they basically want to make it easier for the parliament to appoint judges. And this is based partly on how Orban got away with the politicization of the judicial system. If the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht between them got more than a third of the parliament, it would allow them then to have much greater say over the appointment of judges. So that's the other change. Because if you get more than a third, you can block constitutional changes. You can have a say in appointing the judges. So that's something else that he's trying to get through. So he's basically, it's slightly, I think, one, he's doing it out of genuine national interest, but also it's a bit of a trap for Merz. Now, a lot of the SPD think basically, look, Scholz, you've not been that great. Maybe you should think about sort of legging it before the election. He's not going to do that. He's going to fight the election. He thinks he can close the gap, but I think they're heading to a Merz-Pistorius-led coalition after the election.
And the big story behind this is that the German economy is in bits. I mean, Europe's largest economy, the great powerhouse that, when I was in Cameron or Theresa May governments, we looked at with envy, is going to struggle to avoid a 0.1% recession this year. And so there'll be a lot of pressure on the CDU coming in to do much more radical economic policies, because there are elements in the CDU who basically saw Angela Merkel, who was a right-wing politician, as a closet socialist, and believe that all the kind of social democratic policies which we used to admire have gone wrong, that there's too much subsidy, there's too much red tape, they've got their skills strategy wrong, they're over-reliant on expensive energy, and that Germany needs a real shake-up. So part of the question is, will CDU try to come in on the back of a kind of big radical economic reform message, and will it be able to deliver it?
The other thing about Merz, which is worth knowing, is that when Angela Merkel did her famous Wir schaffen es, letting in a lot of the when there was the kind of the immigration crisis and a lot went to Germany, Merz was very, very opposed to that. So he's got a kind of record on immigration that probably will help him vis-a-vis the AfD. But I think the worry, he may be tempted to go down the kind of Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Rwanda, close the borders, that type of route. And just as you and I have always thought you can't out Farage, I think there's a real danger if they try to out the AfD on the rhetoric.
We should talk more about this, because I think this is something where we could have an agreeable disagreement maybe over the next couple of weeks, because I think that moderate parties need to have much clearer policies on immigration, and it's the only way they're going to survive.
Well, the question is whether you can have a clear policy and clear rhetoric. They're two different things.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.